Good evening. I'm Carl Van Ness, the University of Florida's court historian. The official title is University Historian, but I sometimes feel that the first title might be more accurate. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture in the Rehumanizing the University series. The George A. Smathers Libraries is one of the many co-sponsors of the program, and we are happy to serve as the venue for what has been a very successful and wonderful series of speakers. Bonnie Ephros, Director of the U.S. Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, will shortly introduce our speaker. But as a prelude, I have been asked to say something historical, which seems entirely within the duties of the university historian. The University of Florida in Gainesville began its history on September 26, 1906, as the designated public university for white men. White at that time being defined as not of African descent. Only 102 students enrolled that year, and they were not only white and male, but with the exception of one odd Armenian student, they were all Protestant. There were no Jewish students in 1906, but a single Jewish student did enroll the following year. His name was Joseph Jakey Jacobson of Jacksonville, and he started a trend that continues today. Today we have more than one Jewish student. We have more than 6,000. And we claim to have the highest Jewish enrollment of any public university outside of Israel. I always like to mention that Jakey Jacobson was one of 17 members of the quasi-mythical student group called the Bo Gator Club that may or may not have been the inspiration for the Gator nickname. I like to think that Jakey's acceptance as a brother Gator, Bo being Southern for brother, for those of you who don't speak Southern, that his acceptance was an indicator of things to come, that perhaps I'm making too much of that. Between Jakey and today, much has happened to transform the university from the nearly homogeneous body that it was then to the incredibly diverse institution it is today. People's attitudes have also changed considerably over the years. One story from 1966 symbolizes that change, and it involves the person in this photograph. Her name is Donna K. Berger, and in addition to being a cheerleader, she was also elected to the university's Student Hall of Fame, Campus Who's Who, and she was a member of Savant, which was the women's equivalent of Florida Blue Key. Back in those days, women could not be admitted to Florida Blue Key. She was also a member of Delta Phi Epsilon, one of two predominantly Jewish sororities on campus. And for a period of time, she dated a football player who was a member of Alpha Tau Omega. Alpha Tau Omega, ATO, is the university's oldest social fraternity, has its roots in Southern history. I believe it is the oldest Southern fraternity. It's very conservative, very Southern, very traditional. Well, one day, several ATO brothers approached this football player and informed him that men in ATO did not date women in Delta Phi Epsilon. As the story was told to me, and I'm sure the story has been embellished over the years, and I'm sure I'm embellishing it right now, the football player doesn't get it right away. And after a while, though, he either gets it or it's spelled out to him. And at that point, he says, well, that's really stupid. That's a dumb rule. I can date whoever I want to date. And this starts an argument in the ATO house. And the ATO house is divided, split, until the most predominant member of the ATO, Heisman-winning quarterback Stephen Spurrier, chimes in. And when he's asked his opinion as to the matter, he states, well, quite logically, that Donna was a cheerleader, his brother in ATO was a football player, and of course they could date. To conclude, I think this story, which may be as mythical as the Bo Gators, illustrates that the University of Florida has never been the typical Southern university when it comes to Jews and Gentiles. We have always been a little different in that regard. So without further ado, I'll introduce Bonnie Ephros, who is going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
welcome. My name is Bonnie Afras, and for those of you who don't know me, I direct the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. As always, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the series, Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts, a project that many of you know began last year and to date has brought 10 speakers to campus in the last 14 months, leading up to tonight's lecture by Professor Marcia Sinnott. As I've noted at previous events, there'll be one last speaker on campus on the 15th of November, Professor Harry Brighouse in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will conclude our series with a lecture on possible future reforms that might take place at American public universities. And next semester, we plan to continue our rich discussions with a series of public roundtables focused specifically on issues related to the University of Florida. In other words, we'll bring these conversations home to talk about our own institution. These fora will address issues such as academic freedom, diversity issues on campus as well as in the curriculum, the impact of the Johns Committee, and the need for stronger relationships between the humanities and the STEM fields. The academic year will conclude in April with a public lecture by Professor Sheila Slaughter of the University of Georgia, who will speak on the future of higher education in the context of academic capitalism. I do want to remind you, after our lecture is concluded, that in the cases in the back of the room, we have a number of displays that, in honor of the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act, that were put together by the University Archivist, Dr. Peggy McBride, and those are, you're welcome to peruse the contents. And also we have some literature on the table there, as well as a sign-up sheet if you want to get onto the center's mailing list. Over the course of the last year and a half, our speakers have discussed the place and contributions of the humanities to higher education. Tonight's lecture by Professor Marcia Sinnott addresses the influence of university admissions policies on the communities they shape. In making a case study of three of the so-called Ivy League universities, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and their policies from the 1920s of maintaining an informal quota system for Jewish students that remained in place for nearly half a century, Professor Sinnott will offer her thoughts on the immediate as well as long-term impact of these restrictive policies on those campuses. Given the current political tensions that exist in conjunction with the question of affirmative action, and particularly the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas, now being considered by the Supreme Court, the example of the quota system has much food for thought to offer those who think of universities as laboratories for social change and for social justice. Before continuing with a more formal introduction of Professor Sinnott, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the sponsors that have made tonight's event possible, including numerous organizations here on campus as well as off campus. In particular, I want to thank the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish History, as well as the Rothman Endowment for the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. And I also wanted to thank, for their hard work, Sophia Akerd, Matt Delvaux, Debbie Whalen, Sandy James, and Mitch Hart for helping to prepare for this lecture. And now at last, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Marcia Sinnott, who's the Distinguished Professor of History Emerita at the University of South Carolina, where she taught U.S. history, the history of American women, and public history. She received her doctorate from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and her books include The Half-Open Door, Discrimination and Admissions at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, 1900 to 1970, and a forthcoming volume called Student Diversity at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton Universities, 1920 to 2010, which will be forthcoming in August of 2013. She's also currently finishing a biography of Alice Spearman Wright, who was a Southern white civil rights activist whose papers are held at the University of South Carolina. She's published numerous essays on a variety of topics, including women's access to higher education, African American women and desegregation, legal decisions affecting university admissions policies, and race, gender, and religion more generally at American universities. In 1988, she held a Fulbright lectureship in American Civilization at the American Institute at the University of Oslo in Norway. So without further cutting into her time, I ask that you please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Sinnott for her talk this evening entitled From the Margins to the Mainstream, Jewish Students and Administrators at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton.
Thank you for the very nice introduction. Okay, I have to talk over here. You might say, why Harvard, Yale, and Princeton? I must say the people at the University of South Carolina, where I taught since 1972, wondered why Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But I said, well, that's what my dissertation director suggested that I do, and I forged forward. And I learned a lot about archival policy, and there are all kinds of rules and regulations at these colleges for using the archives, like 50-year rules and 40-year rules, and you just wonder if you're going to live long enough to get into the papers you want to see, and that's still an issue today. But they were the so-called Big Three, named after football, but the point is that's where they were the big football players. By the way, Harvard currently has one of the longest winning streaks in football, like 11 games or 12 games without being defeated, and they're bragging about that in the Boston Globe and things like that. But I don't think they'd fare very well against the University of Florida, and I'm not even sure they'd fare very well against South Carolina either. So I hope to make this somewhat, I guess I have to figure out how all this works. And let's see what happens. Okay, Matt put together some very nice slides of the campuses I'm talking about from the old days, and this is what they looked like after the World War I. I don't have slides for the more contemporary part, but it gives you a sort of flavor for what the campuses look like, and think of them as covered in ivy and all of that. This is the famous Widener Library that was built to honor Harry Elkins Widener, who went down in the Titanic. And I began one of the great moments of my life as an undergraduate at Radcliffe. Yes, I did not go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, but I went to Radcliffe, a coordinate college at Harvard. We were smarter than they were anyway. We worked harder too. But one of the great moments of my life as a junior was getting a stack pass to the stacks. And so I really enjoyed the era of actually reading books. Now I go online like everybody else. So, okay, without too much more ado, I'm going to hopefully do this right. Okay. All right, was that the one I want? No, I wanted actually something else. No, I'll get to it. And I'm going to, okay, I guess we go back to the handout. Okay, the handout that you have has sort of my first paragraph, so I don't want to go over all of that and waste everybody's time, but I begin with this quotation by Benjamin Epstein and Arnold Forster in their book on anti-Semitism in the United States called Some of My Best Friends. And they say this in 1962, and it is absolutely still true today. The university is America writ small. In sum, the entire gamut of discrimination that exists in society as a whole is reproduced in university society, and he goes on to say restrictive admission to prejudicial treatment after matriculation. So you really do have to look at, I should probably get next to the microphone, as universities as reflecting the times in which they live in. And I think they do today. I think they're much better than they were back then, but they do reflect this. And then I go on this to list the books that have been mentioned, and I need not go back over them, but I will now sort of begin my talk and sort of say that from my studies, I decided or discerned three different phases in the history of Jewish quotas, beginning in the 1870, 1917, then 1918, 1947, and the late 1940s to 1970s. And of course, this does interface with immigration history and these East Coast, as you know, Ellis Island and so forth. They got many, many immigrants coming to Europe, from Europe to the United States. So, and they settled there. Some went west, but a lot settled there. So the colleges on the East Coast, and some of the best colleges became a focal point for the issue of quotas. So in the first period, 1870 to 1917, the pattern of anti-Semitic discriminations began and then sharpened in reaction to this immigration, largely from Eastern Europe and Russia, and also from Italy, but the Italians were later in applying to higher education. And they soon began to become very numerous. There was a commission in 1908, the Dillingham Commission, that did reports on immigration. And they found that 7.5% of almost 33,000 students surveyed in 85 institutions were Jewish, which is a very high percentage and very commendable. And in an area like New York City, there were over 7,000 Jews among Jewish students among over 18,000 students in the greater New York area. Nationally at this time, Jews were roughly a little over 3% of the population, and they were triple that number in most of the leading American colleges and universities. I was very interested in your comment, because I hadn't known this, that Florida has the largest Jewish enrollment of any public university outside of Israel. That's a very interesting piece of information. So what you had then is you had the colleges and universities in the East Coast cities saying, oh, why are all these people coming? They're, disrupting the kinds of students we've been used to seeing in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So they began imposing quotas. Jewish students then began applying to the Midwest, the South, the West Coast, and then they began to find geographic restrictions on them too. They did eventually, many of them did get into college because they applied to 8 times or 8 applications. And so this went on from 1918 to 1917 was the first phase. The second phase was an intensification from 1918 to 1947. And the other thing you have to remember about that phase is that you had the Depression in the 1930s, and there was a big competition for jobs. For example, there were quotas in medical schools against Jewish students, dental schools, law schools, and so forth, because there was a question of who can get a good job. And I would like to say, and I can't get into it in this lecture, but I have also studied quotas that occurred in the Western European countries, not just Nazi Germany, but Eastern European countries after the collapse of the old empires, and there were quota systems there. It just seemed to be that, if you were responding to a new group that was coming to your doors and you said, well, we have questions about them, we don't want them, they're not us, and so forth, the reaction just seemed to be the numerus clausus or quota. Quotas continued flourishing in the United States after World War II, I would say in large measure because a lot of the people who were leaders in academia were still around. They didn't all retire at the end of World War II. They were still around and pretty healthy, and they had those points of view. But the eventual elimination of quotas did result from a number of factors: the defeat of Nazism and fascism in World War II, the accelerated wartime graduation rates. You couldn't be in college 4 years, it had to be about 3. The GI Bill of Rights that brought thousands of veterans to colleges and universities. The post-war commitment of President Harry Truman's Committee on Civil Rights and Commission on Higher Education in 1947. In addition, there was the Mayor's Committee on Unity in New York City that denounced discrimination in higher educational institutions, and states like New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts passed fair educational practice laws forcing colleges and professional schools to delete questions on nationality, race, and religion from applications. I do not know the exact date in which there were no more quotas anywhere, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act definitely outlawed institutional discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or sex. And at the same time, there were, even at Harvard, and Yale and Princeton, though I mentioned there were still the old guard were still around, a number of the younger men had served in World War II. They came back, and they had a sort of different vision of where the Harvard and Yale and Princeton should be going. And they put some pressure. It took time on, let's broaden our educational mission. Let's bring in more people that are different. We can't just sort of be in a little bubble all by ourselves. So, but even though as the quotas ended, and the Jewish enrollment rose again, the problem, too, was were Jews welcomed on campus and not saying, well, you can't date this person because you're Jewish, or you can't go out and join this club. That took a much longer period of time. Probably, I'm going to give some historical perspectives on anti-Semitism and Jewish quotas, but the first one to impose quotas was Columbia University, the undergraduate division, by President Nicholas Mary Butler, who cut Jewish enrollment from 40% to 20% just after World War I. And this story is richly detailed in Harold Wexler's The Qualified Student, A History of Selective College Admission in America in 1977. And Harold and I met several times doing research, and we were on a panel together in Houston at the Organization of American Historians in the spring of 2011. So his was really a very important study. And then, of course, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton looked at what Columbia was doing and say, oh my, if they're doing that, we should do the same thing. And so they would cut their Jewish enrollment to 15% or less if they could at Harvard, 10% at Yale, thereabouts, and 3% at Princeton. Now, I'm going to take some issues with some of the other people who have written. That's what historians do. They argue with people who've written on the same subject, whether they should or not. And there was a very good book on Harvard, Yale, and Princeton that came out in 2005 by Jerome Karabel called The Chosen, The Hidden History of Admissions and Exclusion at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. It's a very long book. My book, The Half-Open Door, is a lot shorter. Oops, sorry about that. I'll get this. Shouldn't lift things up here. But he also is worth looking at if you're interested in the subject. He talks about the origins of selective admissions, the struggle over meritocracy, and the inclusion and persistence of privilege, taking the story up to 2005. And he says the struggle over admissions policy that began in the 1920s marked the beginning of a battle over the definition of merit between WASPs. And if you don't know who a WASP is, have everyone heard of a WASP? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay, good. So if I refer to that again, you know. The battle of definition of merit between WASPs and Jews that did not end until half a century later. Even in 2005, he said, it influences the admissions policies of the nation's elite colleges. I do think, to some extent, he sort of idealized the time in which you had admission by examination only. Well, I think we all should realize, and I think probably you do, that you could be perhaps a bad test taker, but if you have money, you can hire a tutor, and that can help you get in. And that happened back in the 1920s and 30s. The well-to-do children could be tested till they passed the test. And today, again, people can boost their SAT scores by going and getting tutors. So there are differences there. Now, for A. Lawrence Lowell, who was the president of Harvard from 1909 to 1933, he is my least favorite university president. He was Harvard class of 1877, and he was a complete snob. That's the simplest thing, you know. They used to say about Boston, the Cabots speak only to the Lowells, and the Lowells speak only to God, you know. Take that as you wish. But he basically said that he wanted frank quotas worked out in cooperation with Jews, which he preferred over Columbia's indirect methods. I might also say Lowell was national president of the Immigration Restriction League, so you know where he's coming from. And he was on the commission to review the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, and of course he said that they were guilty and so forth. Lowell tried to force this through on the faculty at Harvard in 1923. They resisted, but then after the whole thing subsided, he basically figured an indirect way of doing it. One was to limit the size of the freshman class to 1,000, and then you can begin to select more carefully who you want. And then he basically authorized the admissions committee to use a lot of discretion in picking who they wanted. At its high point at Harvard, the number of Jews enrolling in the freshman class had reached over 27%, and it would drop to between 12 and 15%, so you can see that's quite a drop. Okay. I now talk a little bit of why quotas were imposed on American Jews during a time of relative prosperity. So I basically concluded that academic anti-Semitism arose from and was sustained by a combination of factors: petty social snobbery, intellectual mediocrity, and the fear that they would compete successfully with WASPs for entrance into the most prestigious colleges, universities, and graduate and professional schools. And administrators and faculty at elite private universities readily attributed to Jews in the aggregate characteristics of clannishness, pushiness, and social offensiveness that they might not have ascribed to most of them individually. For the good of the entire student body, they argued, the number of Jews had to be limited to a percentage that could be absorbed without changing the character of that institution. Now, when they did get into these colleges, they often felt like they were social outcasts and very isolated in the campuses. So one response at some universities was for Jews to begin forming their own fraternities. You already mentioned the Jewish fraternities at Florida. Zeta Beta Tau was formed at City College in New York in 1903. Now, one thing that helped to improve the situation for Jews at a college like Harvard was the founding of the Menorah Society in 1906. The pivotal figure here was Horace Meyer Callan, Harvard AB 1903, who had returned to Harvard to write his dissertation in philosophy under Professor William James after Callan was dismissed for being an avowed unbeliever. He was the son of an Orthodox rabbi who had emigrated with his family from Germany. And he came up with a concept of what he called Hebraism, Jewish history and culture influenced by James's pragmatism should be the focus of this new group. He did become a Zionist by 1902. Menorah chapters spread to 80 campuses nationwide. They joined the International Collegiate Menorah Association, founded in 1913. And in 1915, the Menorah Association launched the Menorah Journal under Henry Hurwitz, Harvard 1908, a publication that continued into the 1960s. The author of a book on the Menorah Society, Daniel Green, said that it promoted a cultural definition of Jewish identity, resulting in a Jewish cultural renaissance that would find a place within a larger, inclusive American national identity. It wasn't a melting pot. Each group would have its own identity within the larger. Callan was influenced also by the literature professor Barrett Wendell, who recognized that New England Puritanism had been deeply influenced by the Old Testament and Hebraic customs. In contrast, President Lowell rejected pluralism in favor of a homogenous America based on Anglo culture. No surprise. He declined all invitations to address the Menorah Society. He maintained examination schedules held on Jewish holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Indeed, according to Callan, as Callan wrote in the magazine The Nation, Lowell advocated quotas because he was really afraid that Jews were assimilating too successfully. Now, over time, a new group came on the campus, B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation, that seemed to have a broader focus, recognizing students' changing interests, social activities, and fraternities. Now, among the Ivy League, as I said, I've told you what happened At Harvard, the 12 to 15%. Yale would be reduced to 10%, and Princeton, along with Dartmouth, about 2 to 3% or so forth. The most generous colleges in the Ivy League were the University of Pennsylvania, 20%, Brown University, 14%, Cornell, upstate New York, 12%. I mean, they were relatively, they weren't high percentages, but they didn't have that level of discrimination. The so-called Seven Sister Colleges, and you may have heard of those, Wellesley and so forth, they also were discriminated, although there was a range of from 6% to about 12% of Jewish students admitted to those colleges. Now, an interesting insight into this is an article that I read by Alvin Johnson, a Columbia University-trained economist and the founding director of the New School for Social Research in 1939. And he attributed the growth of anti-Semitism in the United States in part to the publications of the fraudulent Protocols of the Elder of Zion. And he has said that American public opinion was, quote, beclouded by vague anti-Semitic notions, and the educational institutions, humanely anti-Semitic by tradition, felt more free to exercise the predilections, he wrote. Not openly, to be sure, for no elite ever lays its cards on the table. Instead, they use geographic criteria, ask for religious affiliation, father's nationality, photographs, and so forth. And Johnson recalled frequently being asked by my Jewish friends to help in getting a son or daughter into college. There wasn't much he could do, but during the 1930s and 40s, Johnson helped bring dozens of Central European Jewish scholars to the university in exile, a graduate division of the New School. I would like to now move from Lowell, who left office in 33, I might say, until he died 10 years later, his presence sort of hovered over Harvard. And his successor has received both a lot of praise for being a meritocrat and a lot of recent criticism for being somewhat anti-Semitic. So I did want to discuss that in some detail. He was James Bryan Conant, class of 1914. He took office at 40 when he was 40. And Lowell wrote his successor right away, quote, "The time has not come for any theoretical solution of the Jewish question. Any educational institution that admits an unlimited proportion of Jews will soon have no one else." So right away, that's what Conant had. Now, Conant, I don't think he enthusiastically endorsed quotas, but he didn't fight that hard against them or give, say we won't give generous preferences to alumni sons, private school graduates. But he did try to raise academic standards. And one thing he did was inaugurate a national scholarship program in 1934 that recruited students nationwide. So anytime you begin to raise academic standards for admission, that is helpful. All right, the other thing that Conant had, I said he was 40 years old. All right, he came into a Harvard that had so many older professors who were entrenched. And they don't like young upstart university presidents telling them what to do. And there was a big sort of debate over the tenure policy at Harvard in the late 1930s. And some of the old faculty were unhappy with how he was handling it, and he had to sort of apologize for how he was conducting it to avoid the possible formation of a committee to investigate university governance. It all started when two economics professors, neither of whom were Jewish, but they were probably a little left-wing, were denied tenure. So in May 1937, a committee of 8 was formed to review Harvard's tenure and promotion criteria. And they reported in March of 1939. And I'm reading this, what they concluded, because it revealed the depth of the anti-Semitism in regard to faculty and why it was very difficult. Quote, this is from their report. In the United States, anti-Semitic feeling has operated within the universities themselves in the form of a prejudice which is difficult to prove and never officially proclaimed. Though the prejudice has not, as in totalitarian countries, Nazi Germany, for example, it has made it difficult for Jews otherwise eligible to attain initial appointments, and there is reason to believe has retarded their advancement to higher rank. The Committee of Eight declared, quote, conscious or unconscious anti-Semitism is a betrayal of the best traditions of the university. But they didn't do much more than sort of say that. The Harvard administration was not ready to take action to eliminate anti-Semitism, nor were they willing to admit more than a few African-American graduate students. Same reason. We can admit them, but we can't get them placed, so why have them? Harvard at this point, even though the Harvard professors were still teaching Radcliffe students separately at Radcliffe. They didn't study in Harvard classrooms till World War II, but they didn't want to hire really very many women professors. They just said, even if you were the best, considered one of the best young scholars in your discipline, you wouldn't get hired at Harvard, because that's just the way they seem to be. One of the prejudiced, entrenched old guards of the Harvard faculty was Julian Lowell Coolidge, so he was a relative of some sort of A. Lawrence Lowell, chair of the mathematics department and master of Lowell House, who complained to President Conant in May 1939 about the vexing question of the numbers of the Jews in Harvard College, their 15% in the residential houses, and, quote, the notoriously largely Semitic commuters. And he pointed out, look, in 1932, the masters of the 7 residential houses had a gentleman's agreement. We said we would limit Jewish sophomores, juniors, and seniors who lived in these residential houses after having been in the freshman dorms to 10%. That's what we wanted. This was our gentleman's agreement. Now we're finding the number of Jews in the residential houses has risen higher than that, 12% or higher. How come? Well, the admissions office had to point out that while they kept their admissions numbers lower, 10% or 12, as low as they could, Jewish students survived academically after freshman year and therefore were eligible to seek admission to the residential houses as sophomores. But then Coolidge concluded by urging the admission committee to be ever more vigilant in controlling Jewish admission to Harvard College. Now, in July 1940, there were economic conditions, fewer applicants, and so the admissions committee needed to admit more students to get enough bodies there to pay tuition. You get the idea. And so President Conant, I think he was being somewhat sarcastic. He said to the admissions director he did not want to lower unduly the standards of admissions, and he said no one should be admitted to Harvard College who has not at least a 50-50 chance of being promoted to the sophomore class. That is not a very tough standard. But they were admitting people who could pay, people who were well-to-do. Now, I would like to turn to student religious affiliations. You've been wondering what this was, but you can go and get the freshmen were asked voluntarily to fill out religious forms, and the idea was that they could, would be put in touch with someone of their particular faith. It took a while. I was limited to how many I could see. I couldn't see any beyond 1940 because of various restrictions on archival research. Maybe you have them here in Florida, too. But I excerpted the ones from the 1920s. And if you can see that, and they call Jews Hebrews, by the way, interchangeably, that the Episcopalians are doing very well in numbers. They climb right into the 1930s. The Jewish students do actually begin to increase after sort of this low point, and by the mid-30s, they're moving upward in number. But if you counted all Protestants, there would be more of them than anybody else. I would say one positive thing about Harvard is it did abolish compulsory chapel in 1886. And you were saying today, Florida, what was the deal on chapel at Florida?
Probably sometime around World War I.
Okay. So but Yale required chapel attendance till 1926, and Princeton required twice-a-month chapel for freshmen till the early 60s. But what you do find when you tell students to go to chapel, that the numbers decline over time. And I just would want to be illustrative. You have the administration who wants to be training these Christian gentlemen, but in the 1886, over 91% of Harvard students had attended daily chapel. It dropped to just over 30% by the early 1900s. It plummeted to 7.6% in 1930-31. And on average, out of a college enrollment of 3,240, only 59 students a day went to daily chapel. So you can see were not in sync with what the administration wanted. Now, what had been happening, and I found this interesting too, that Harvard had become Unitarian because the Unitarian, if you've ever heard of them, but anyway, they took over Harvard Divinity School. So they were in the early 1800s, Ralph Waldo Emerson, people like that. And they had been the largest group in the middle of the 19th century, 37%. But what you had with the rise of the Episcopalians, there was something that was called Episcopal boarding schools. In other words, the Episcopal Church formed private schools for education, and their nickname was the St. Grottelsex Group, which stood for St. Paul, St. Mark's, St. George's, and Groton and Middlesex. And these were the feeder schools. These were the favored schools. And there was a very sort of a cozy, friendly relationship between the headmasters of the boarding schools and the colleges. And so they rise in number. Now, the numbers of Jews and of Catholics was very, very small. There had been only a handful, but by 1908, there were almost 9% Catholic and 7% Jewish. So, okay, and I've shown you this, and I will go. That's Widener Library again, and let's try this. Okay. This is from the mid-1936, and it just shows you the range of different denominations at Harvard, a wide group. And you've got a chart for it, so I don't need to spend a lot of time over it. But you do see, for example, among Jews, again, they are, by 1936-37, they're 905. So they are edging up. And in general, the enrollment of Catholic and Jewish students began to rise in the 1940s. Harvard became more welcoming to non-Protestants. Catholics were probably welcomed earlier than Jews. They had a Catholic on the Harvard Corporation, the governing board. Harvard conferred an honorary degree on the powerful Archbishop of Boston. Catholic alumni begin to increase in number. And so probably by 1954, about 12% of the students in Harvard College were Roman Catholic. By the presidency of John F. Kennedy John F. Kennedy class of 1940, but he was president elected in 1960. There were probably 1,000 Catholics at the university. Among Jewish students, they begin to rise in number. There were 12% in the class of 1944, and they said after that they reached by the mid-50s, according to some estimates, as high as 25% of undergraduates. At the same time as more Catholics and Jews come into the university, Unitarians, which had been the dominant religious denomination, drop from over 30% to 4%, and even Episcopalians decrease in number from 22% to under 15%. But nevertheless, despite that, and this is the second stage, how do you make people who are different or seen as different feel welcome on your campus? Well, Harvard had something called Memorial Church that had been built in honor of those who had served in World War I and lost their lives. All kinds of Harvard graduates contributed to this of all different religious denominations. But non-Christian private religious services, including marriages between mixed faith couples, were still excluded in the 1950s. This policy, however, was supported by President Nathan Marsh Pusey at the time and the University Board of Preachers. But there were voices that spoke out against it. Jerome Green, a former overseer and secretary to the Harvard Corporation, who had opposed Lowell in the 1920s, was still around to decry the policy of barring Jewish weddings and funerals from Memorial Church, since Jews had contributed generously to the church's construction and had died in wartime service. Green said it, quote, showed a tragic lack of Christian charity and was not the spirit of Harvard. He wrote the editor of the Harvard Crimson in 1958 to claim that Protestant Christianity had a monopoly of ultimate truth. Because of his opposition and the opposition of other faculty and alumni, the Harvard Corporation opened Memorial Church in that April to all private religious services. Now, I do want to talk a little bit on another topic, and I hope I'm not jumping around too much, but I wanted to talk about the issue of Jewish faculty and refugee scholars. Again, on Conant, he's been criticized rather sharply for being welcoming to the Germans, this Putzi Hofstangl, who had gotten his degree at Harvard, and he came back to Cambridge, and Conant has been criticized by welcoming him there when he came back for his 25th Harvard class reunion in June 1954. Conant and the Harvard Corporation actually rejected Hofstangl's offer of a $1,000 scholarship for a Harvard student to study in Germany, and in 1935 Harvard awarded honorary degrees to Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, both refugees from Germany. Moreover, it took him a while, but by 1938 Conant had joined with other college presidents in denouncing the Nazi Kristallnacht pogrom against Jews in Germany. And in 1939, the Harvard Corporation provided $2,500 scholarships to bring over refugee students to Cambridge. But nevertheless, when you think about taking a stand on critical issues, Harvard had not been a leader in wanting to find a place for refugee scholars fleeing Nazism. The New School for Social Research did this. And one critic who came from England to look and see where he might open up some universities to place refugee scholars just said that if Harvard doesn't take a stand, it doesn't support the diversity of scholarship. It would deprive America's oldest university of the opportunity to set high standards for its sister institutions in this and other countries. There were exceptions that were more willing to make place for refugees of scholars. David Lynn Edsel, former dean of the Harvard Faculty of Medicine, chaired the committee, a national committee for the resettlement of foreign physicians. But it wasn't really much of an effort. Now, having sort of said this, it's obviously one can only give Conant a sort of C- on the whole issue. But what you do find when you look closely in archival papers is that he, in another way, was willing, I think earlier than some other universities, to hire a superbly qualified Jewish physician who had emigrated to the United States in 1920. In a 1938 letter to a member of the Harvard Corporation, Conant noted the favorable recommendation of the Harvard Medical School for the hiring of Dr. Soma Weiss as physician-in-chief of Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston. Weiss had studied at the Royal Hungarian University in Budapest, then earned bachelor's degrees from Columbia and a doctor's MD from Cornell. And I think with Conant, he looked at this and said, well, this guy has a lot to offer Harvard, and maybe we can get some grant funds for it. And what's also interesting, and this does show that people can change over time, Dr. Weiss's appointment was enthusiastically endorsed by Dr. Henry Asbury Christian, who was retiring from the position that Weiss would take. And he just says, quote, "In case anyone questions the desirability of this man on the basis of his nationality or religious persuasion, let me say in my early days in Boston I was prejudiced against him, largely as I now see it, for just these reasons." But he said, "When I had the opportunity to know him well and see him often, I realized that my prejudice was unreasonable and that I had misjudged him." Christian later told Weiss that he had won his admiration and respect for and esteem for what he'd done at the Boston City Hospital, and he could count on my warm friendship and my cordial help at any time. And Christian came from Virginia, but he accorded to Weiss what he called the standard of being a fine gentleman by Southern standards. So Weiss, at 40 years, became this Harvard professor and physician-in-chief in September 1939. He was socially well-connected. He'd married Elizabeth Sachs, the daughter of Paul Sachs, a Harvard fine arts professor and internationally renowned art collector. But, you know, he was hired, but at the same time, the Harvard Medical School had 30 Hebrews, 32 Catholics, and 57 Episcopalians. So you still had that going on. What happened with Weiss, he died at an untimely age of 43 in 1942 by a ruptured intracranial aneurysm. And so many people who have studied quotas at Harvard and other places didn't study the medical school, and so it has not been as widely known as it should be. I realize I'm beginning to wear out of time, but I would like to talk about where faculty made some inroads, Jewish faculty made some inroads. Yale hired Professor Milton Charles Winternetz as dean of the Yale Medical School in 1920, the son of a Jewish immigrant physician from Czechoslovakia. And he was in office long enough to reorganize Yale's medical departments, recruit outstanding senior faculty, revise the medical curriculum. Jews also made quite an impact in the law school. Law in general was not seen as a sort of a waspy profession as much as medicine was. So Yale would appoint its first Jewish dean in 1954, the Russian-born Harry Schulman. And then after that, the next four Yale Law School deans were Jewish: Eugene Rostow, Lewis Pollack, Abraham Goldstein, and Harry Wellington. Harvard waited till 1971, and they appointed their first Jewish dean. So one story, and I realize I am running out of time, you may have read the New York Times article about Emory University. Emory confronts its legacy of bias against Jews. How many of you saw that? Did anyone see that? Okay. Well, this again shows that the spread of quotas and discrimination spread from the East Coast to other places. And there were people in dentistry who felt that you should have a quota. In fact, this Dean Bueller at Emory had an application form, and you had to identify your race as Caucasian, Jew, or other. And to discourage Jews from coming, he basically had them fail. So the fail rate from 1948 to 58, the Atlanta Anti-Defamation League discovered the fail rate for Gentile dental students was just over 15%. For Jewish students, it was over 64%. So obviously, you know something's going on there. But there were protests from Jewish citizens, the Anti-Defamation League, and so finally the president of Emory at that time got Bueller to resign and change the application form. But this was not the end of the story for one of the men who had been told to get out of leave Emory, a Mr. Perry Brickman, who then began more recently to interview others like himself who'd been told to leave Emory, and a new documentary film, I haven't seen it of course, called From Silence to Recognition, premiered earlier this month, October 10th, and the current president of Emory met privately with the former Jewish students. So that's a very good article to read. I know I'm running out of time. I hope I can have just a few more minutes to sort of say something about Yale and Princeton. And let's see, more of Harvard. Okay. All right. This is the Yale statistics here. Basically, what we see, I better look here. All right, look. They aren't as late as I would like, but they do begin to show what had happened by the 1950s. The Jewish enrollment is increasing a little bit at Yale, and we can see it again increasing by the 50s. But what is happening is there's sort of the same number of Jewish students admitted every year, and this leads William Horowitz, who went to Yale and graduated in 1929, and he had worked his way through Yale as a Hebrew teacher in a local synagogue, to begin putting pressure on Yale to say, what's going on here? He even ran to become a member of the governing body at Yale, Yale Corporation, becoming its first Jewish member in 1965. And what he was pointing to with sort of flat Jewish enrollment was confirmed by a tabulation in 1961 by Rabbi Richard Israel, director of Yale's B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation, that indicated that 11.8% of the students were Jewish, and which was lower than at 21% at Harvard or even 15% at Princeton, and much lower than Columbia, Cornell, and Pennsylvania. So not until the class of 1962 did Jewish enrollment in Yale College exceed 14%, nor did it consistently average 16% until the late 1960s. So there were investigations of this, and there were still the old guard on the Yale Corporation. But one reason I think Yale was sort of laggard in this respect it was not until the Yale class of 1967 did high school graduates equal the number of private preparatory school graduates. Harvard had achieved that parity in the 1940s and Princeton in the mid-50s. So if you're still admitting students primarily from private schools, you are going to have fewer Jewish students at this time. So the real change came with someone named Kingman, President Kingman Brewster, in the 1960s and 1970s. And today, Jewish enrollment at Princeton, 25%. In 2011, Jewish life at Yale University was described as vibrant and growing rapidly. The faculty embraces religious diversity and meritocracy. To accommodate the university's approximately 2,000 Jewish students, Shabbat at Yale, founded in 2002, in a one-bedroom apartment, has continued to outgrow its space, and there's been a ground was broken in September 2011 for a future campus home and expansion in New Haven. So that ends on a good story there. Again, I'll talk a little bit about Princeton. And the worst thing about Princeton is the upper class eating clubs. And they tended not to admit Jews. It didn't matter who you were, or how well connected you were, or what a good student you were. You would not get a bid from one of the eating clubs, which were for the upperclassmen. And so changes did become a little bit with Princeton with World War II, and even some Princetonians who were WASPs began to speak out and say, look, this is a racial theory more characteristic of our enemies than that of an American university. But even as late as the Princeton class of 1952, there was still a Jewish quota. Recalled Don Oberdorfer, a Jewish person, author of Princeton University, its first 250 years. And even as late as 1958, Princeton gained national notoriety in its infamous Bicker of 58. The Bicker was the process by which you went to freshmen and offered them admission, a bid to an upper-class eating club. Well, in 1958, 15 of the 23 sophomores who did not receive a bid from an upper-class eating club were Jewish. 5 were National Merit Scholars. And that, I think, that was the sort of worst point. And then after that, under President Robert Goheen, Princeton began to admit increasing numbers of ethnic and religious minorities, along with African Americans and then women. And so Princeton has moved forward quite a lot, and Jewish enrollment reached 20% by the late 1970s. They opened a kosher kitchen, offered classes in modern Hebrew, interdisciplinary committee for Jewish studies. According to historian Marianne Sunai, Princeton University today is one of 3 universities in the entire country operating its own kosher kitchen, ironically in close proximity to the private eating clubs which once could make Jewish students' lives so miserable. Indeed, she emphasized, Jewish students today need not come to Princeton to shed their identity, but to find it. And a Hillel admissions committee advises and assists the admissions office in recruiting identifiably Jewish freshmen. Okay, well, one of the problems that has happened is that the enrollment then fluctuates. I might also say, before I talk about the fluctuations, in the early 90s, there was a $4.5 million Center for Jewish Life constructed by Princeton University and operated in partnership with Hillel. Okay, but why about this fluctuations? Princeton, again, class size plays a role. Princeton has a smaller freshman class, 1,150. It's higher now, but I'm talking about the 1990s. Harvard had 1,600, Yale 1,300. And also Princeton preferred athletes and legacies. And also people from the South. So this all sort of depressed the Jewish enrollment. And it even made the front page of the Daily Princetonian campus newspaper. Nevertheless, on the whole, that Princeton has moved forward in the early 2000s, since the turn of the century, to encourage conversations among different religious faiths on campus. In addition to Christian services, Princeton hosted a variety of other religious groups, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, in apparent harmony. Their activities fairs have tables for religious organization, a virtual religion row amid dance and musical and political groups. President Shirley Tillman has been credited, among others, as supporting the students in their choice of religious beliefs. I do want to talk about one more thing about Jewish presidents and administrators at the Big Three, and then I'll quit, okay? I know we all want to have dinner. Okay. It did begin to have an impact on faculty. And what you did have was a significant change in the number of Jewish faculty who were hired. According to historian David Hollinger, the influx of secularized Jews into post-World War II academia. And he said a Carnegie Commission study found that by 1969, Jews were demographically overrepresented by about 700% in the nation's leading departments of history and philosophy. I'll talk about some of the key appointments at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Henry Rossovsky, born in Danzig, was the first Jew elected to the Harvard Corporation. He served as economics professor, dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and even acting president. And at the time of Harvard's 350th anniversary, he wrote an essay, From Periphery to Center, in the Jewish experience at Harvard and Radcliffe. This book here, and I'd just like to read what he said about this change of moving from the periphery to the center. Quote, "It seems to me that the nature of our obligation has necessarily changed over time. Before World War II, we were still underrepresented on the faculty and perhaps marginal in other senses as well. There's a certain luxury in being on the edge. One can be less responsible. One can play on the guilt feelings of the establishment. At this time, however, we are part of the Harvard establishment, whether we like it or not, and thus the future is to a significant extent in our own hands. Therefore, now is the time to add to the role of critic that of builder." And Okay, that sort of sums up what a lot of others also believed. And Yale and Princeton have had Jewish administrators. Amy Gutman was a provost at Princeton, and she became a president of the University of Pennsylvania. Nancy Weiss Malkiel, who went to Smith and Harvard, was the first woman hired by the history department at Princeton in 1969. In 1987, she was appointed dean of the college, and she held that position for 24 years until June 2011, earning this distinction of having served longer than any previous incumbent at Princeton. Yet it still as late as 1966, according to the American Jewish Committee, Jews were rarely given permanent appointments to the presidencies of American colleges and universities, holding less than 1% of the top positions. The first Jewish presidents of major private institutions were Edward Levy at the University of Chicago, 1967, John Kemeny at Dartmouth, 1970, Marvin Meyerson at the University of Pennsylvania, 1971, Michael Sovereign at Columbia, 1980. But what did happen is at Princeton, which was interesting, which had once been so restrictive, was the first of the big three to choose a Jew as its permanent president, Montreal-born Harold Taffler Shapiro in 1988, a Princeton PhD in economics. Harvard chose as its president Leon Rudenstein in 1991. He had attended Princeton, Oxford, and Harvard, and his father was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He's been called the university's first Jewish and professorial president. Also Jewish was the MIT and Harvard-educated economist Larry Summers, Lawrence Henry Summers, a Clinton administration secretary of the Treasury. In 1993, Yale chose Richard Charles Levin, a Stanford graduate with a Yale PhD in economics. He will retire next June as the longest-serving president in the Ivy League. So I think we can conclude, and I need to conclude, that they have moved from the margins to the mainstream. There is a book out that came out in 2011, edited by Eunice Pollack, called Anti-Semitism on the Campus. And it talks about current anti-Semitism. And there's still a lot of harassment, and I'll just read very briefly what it says is that the Anti-Defamation League has reported an average of 88 anti-Semitic incidences annually on American university campuses, ranging from verbal slurs, anti-Jewish and anti-Israel articles, posters, and rallies, disruption of meetings of Jewish students, painting graffiti and swastikas in college hallways. A firebombing at Brown University led to locking down Hillel House and stationing a police officer outside. There's also been Holocaust deniers placing advertisements in campus newspapers, and some faculty members call on their universities to divest from business dealings with Israel and sell off investments in their endowment funds, and have signed petitions against Israeli military actions. So although the anti-Semitism of the past, I think, is over, there still is anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. And on that, I think I will quit, because I've taken far too much time, and I apologize, Bonnie. Okay, if anyone has any questions. Anyone have any questions, or are you very hungry? Yes.
It just so happened that I read something recently, and I read that in Columbia University, many of the Jewish students actually went on to get their second degree because they had problem satisfying the requirements for the first degree. They wouldn't take physical education. So they wouldn't get their first degree, and that would sort of force them to get a master's.
Okay.
Right. So I was wondering if there are more examples like this where restrictions actually drove people to academic excellence rather than keeping them
away.
That may be. I'm not. I go back here. I'm not familiar with that particular case. I know that in some of what I've read about Middle Eastern studies departments, there's been friction between some of the faculty and the students, and making Jewish students feel uncomfortable. That's what I heard about Columbia. They had an issue not too long ago. But in terms of, I think that Jewish students have, and I would say today, and sometimes they've been called, and I don't want to mislabel anyone, they've been called the new Jews. Asian American students also are driven to succeed. And then people say, oh, they're getting too good. There's too many of them, you know what I mean. I forgot to, in all my talk, to show that's Yale, and this is Princeton. Should have shown this. You can see in 1935 there were 5 Jews. That tells you something. And then more on Princeton. I really can't walk and chew gum at the same time, but by 1970 they are increasing in numbers. No, I'm technically challenged. I hope you'll be sympathetic. You know, I need someone who will sit there doing this while I'm doing all this other stuff, or I forget to do it. But you can always tell if there's something funny going on in admissions if you get the statistics and you see that they're flat or they bump up one year and drop precipitously the next. You can see that something's going on, whether you're talking about Jewish students, Asian students, women students, African American students. Either the flat lining of admissions or some, a rise and then a drop. Something's going on. So they say, oh, there's too many of them, Unfortunately. Yeah. Any other questions? Warn you all. Yes.
Please comment on the difference, if there is one, between a quota and what the Supreme Court lawyers now are calling a critical mass.
Yeah, I think everyone now has a question on this particular thing. And I did write an article dealing with Bakke, Grutter versus Bollinger. I think this is one of the questions. What is that? I mean, do you want a critical mass in every single class? I mean, that has been asked. That's almost impossible to achieve. And I'm for affirmative action, but if I'd had more time, I was going to read some comments about we need to find other ways to achieve this diversity. For example, Thomas Espinshade of Princeton said it's time to move beyond affirmative action by encouraging those who care about racial equality to seek alternatives to affirmative action by addressing the deeply entrenched disadvantages that lower income and minority students face from the beginning of life. And that is a laudable goal, but just sort of saying we must have a critical mass or a certain number of people in every class, every discipline, or if the state population is one thing, then your classroom should reflect the population of a group in the state. I think that's treading, almost on a form of a certain kind of a quota. And I think that it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules on that. Because, because if you admit some people, because you say we need more of them, and you deny admission to somebody else who might be equally good academically, that is a problem. I agree with you that is very hard to solve. I mean, there are things you can do. I mean, for women in sciences, when they weren't taking enough science courses, they tried to hire women science faculty in science, a woman dean in science and engineering. And yes, the enrollment of women in Princeton in engineering and Harvard went up. I mean, those are very proactive things that are beneficial, but it's not sort of changing the rules of the game. I hope you'll all pay attention to the Fisher versus Texas and see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. But Espinshade also made the point that basing affirmative action on race is inadequate because it is most successfully used only by the most selective public and private colleges, simply because they have the resources to put into the selection. They're really pretty expert at the game by now, and they get the best students anyway, so it's really picking from very good students. The problem often occurs when you have, larger public universities, and they try to get what they want is approximate percentages of groups of people, and it just doesn't always work successfully. Okay? And I do apologize for A, talking too fast, B, keeping you too long, C, forgetting to advance my slides. Okay? All right. Okay. Anyway, I think didn't you get some of these tables anyway, so you can study them. And they tell a story.